The fastest way to reveal how someone truly values you isn't by chasing, explaining, or proving your worth. It's by quietly removing access. Because when you stop giving value to someone who took you for granted, it's not your silence that shakes them. It's the sudden realization that they no longer have you. When we talk about access being a privilege, not a right, what we're really talking about is the invisible contract that forms the moment you let someone into your life. Your time, your emotional availability, these are some of the most valuable resources you have. Yet so many people give them away as if they're unlimited, as if anyone who shows a flicker of interest automatically deserves full access to them. The truth is, access is something that should expand or contract based on how someone treats you, not based on how much you hope they'll become better. The moment someone realizes they can show up inconsistently and still receive the same warmth and emotional energy from you, they stop seeing access as something special. It becomes familiar, expected, even taken for granted. This is not because they're evil or intentionally cruel, but because human beings tend to value what feels earned. When access is unconditional, it loses its weight. When it's intentional, it carries meaning. Deleting someone's access doesn't mean becoming angry or dramatic. It means aligning your availability with the reality of the relationship. If someone only reaches out when it's convenient, disappears when things require effort, or treats your presence as optional, the most honest response isn't to complain louder. It's to quietly reduce how much of you they get. That's not punishment, that's clarity. What hits the ego in this moment isn't rejection, it's the sudden shift in dynamic. They were used to a version of you that was always there, always responsive, always emotionally open. When that version steps back, it creates a gap. And in that gap, they're forced to confront a question they've been avoiding: why did this change? For the first time, access feels earned or lost. This is where many people get confused and think this is about control. It's not. You're not removing access to provoke a reaction. You're removing access because the level of care you're giving no longer matches the level of care you're receiving. The power of this move comes from its authenticity. It's not a strategy, it's self-respect in action. There's also something deeply grounding that happens internally when you stop overgiving. You begin to feel less anxious, less consumed by someone else's behavior. That emotional freedom is what truly shifts the balance. Ironically, the moment you stop trying to be chosen is often the moment someone finally sees your value. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped offering yourself at a discount. When someone feels that access to you is no longer guaranteed, they're forced to decide what you actually mean to them. Some people step up, others fade away. Both outcomes are informative. The ones who rise understand that connection requires effort. The ones who disappear were attached to convenience, not commitment. Either way, you win because you're no longer investing in someone who doesn't meet you where you are. Treating access as a privilege is an act of leadership in your own life. It says, I value myself enough to notice how I'm being treated. It replaces emotional pleading with quiet confidence. And that's why it hits the ego, not because you're trying to hurt someone, but because you're no longer giving them something they didn't earn. When we say you don't announce boundaries, you live them, we're pointing to a subtle but powerful shift in how self-respect actually works in real life. Many people believe that setting a boundary means sitting someone down and explaining in great detail what they're doing wrong and what needs to change. But the truth is, long explanations often come from a place of hope rather than strength. They're attempts to negotiate respect instead of embodying it. When you announce a boundary without changing your behavior, you're still giving the other person control over whether that boundary is honored. You're saying, here's what I need, but then waiting to see if they'll comply. Living a boundary removes that dependency. It's not about making a declaration, it's about making a decision. The moment you change how available you are, how quickly you respond, or how much emotional energy you offer, the boundary becomes real without a single word being spoken. This approach feels unreliable for many people because it removes the safety of explanation. There's no speech, no closure conversation, no dramatic line that makes the change feel justified. Instead, there's quiet consistency. And that consistency is what creates impact. When someone notices that you're no longer always there, no longer bending your schedule, no longer over-functioning to keep the connection alive, it forces them to pay attention in a way that words never could. Living a boundary also protects your dignity. When you explain yourself repeatedly to someone who already knows they're falling short, you slowly erode your own sense of worth. You begin to feel like your needs are a burden. But when you simply adjust your behavior to match the reality of how you're being treated, you're affirming internally that your needs matter, even if the other person never acknowledges them. There's an important emotional shift that happens here. Announced boundaries often invite debate. They open the door to excuses and half-promises. Lived boundaries close that door. They don't argue with words, they respond with action. And action is far harder to ignore. Someone can dismiss a conversation, but they can't ignore a changed dynamic. This isn't about being passive-aggressive or punishing someone with silence. It's about alignment. If someone treats you like an option, you stop treating them like a priority. If someone shows up inconsistently, you stop organizing your life around their unpredictability. The boundary exists not to teach them a lesson, but to keep you from abandoning yourself. What often surprises people is how much calmer they feel when they stop announcing boundaries. There's less emotional labor, less rehearsing conversations in your head, less waiting for validation. You reclaim energy that was once spent managing someone else's behavior. And that calm is exactly what shifts the power dynamic, not because you're trying to win, but because you're no longer over-invested in the outcome. For the other person, this can be unsettling. They may sense something has changed but can't mention a dramatic moment. That uncertainty is what prompts reflection. When access quietly changes, they're left to interpret it on their own, which often leads to more honesty than if they were handed a script. Living boundaries is ultimately an act of trust. Trust in yourself. Trust that you don't need to convince someone to treat you well. Trust that the right people will respond to your consistency, not your explanations. And trust that even if someone doesn't step forward, you've protected your peace by letting your actions speak for you. When we say the ego feels the absence before the heart does, we're describing a very human reaction to loss that has less to do with love and more to do with control. The ego is attached to familiarity, predictability, and reassurance. It likes knowing that someone is there, available, responsive, and emotionally invested. When that presence disappears quietly, without drama or explanation, the ego is often the first part to react, not because of deep emotional connection, but because something it relied on has been removed. The heart processes loss slowly. It reflects, remembers, and grieves. The ego, on the other hand, reacts immediately. It notices the missing text, the delayed response, the absence of emotional availability. And what unsettles it most isn't anger or confrontation, but peace. When you step back without resentment, without trying to prove a point, it disrupts the story the ego was telling itself, that you would always be there, that your emotional state was tied to their behavior, that they had influence over your attention. This is why calm absence is so powerful. If you leave angrily, the ego can dismiss it as drama. If you plead or explain, the ego feels important. But when you withdraw with dignity, the ego loses its anchor. There's no conflict to react against, no emotional chaos to manage. Just a quiet shift that says, you no longer have the same access. That's deeply destabilizing to someone who is unconsciously benefiting from your availability. What hits the ego isn't the fear of losing you emotionally, it's the fear of losing relevance. The realization that you're okay without them challenges the idea that they were central to your happiness. Suddenly, the view changes. They're no longer the one being chased or prioritized. Instead, they're the one left wondering what changed, replaying interactions, questioning their assumptions. This is also why chasing rarely works. When you chase, you reinforce the ego. You communicate that their presence defines your worth, that their attention is necessary for your emotional stability. But when you choose peace over pursuit, you send the opposite message. You demonstrate emotional self-sufficiency. And nothing exposes the ego's insecurity faster than realizing it's no longer needed to feel significant. It's important to understand that this isn't about hurting someone. The ego reaction is simply a byproduct of a healthier choice. When you stop overextending yourself, when you stop trying to manage someone else's interest, you naturally create space. And in that space, the ego feels the loss of control long before the heart has time to catch up. Often, this is when someone reaches out, not with clarity, but with curiosity, not with vulnerability, but with testing behavior. The ego wants reassurance that it still matters, that access can be restored. This is where many people break their own progress by rushing back, or reoffering everything that was just withdrawn. But holding your ground doesn't mean being cold. It means staying aligned with your peace. If the heart eventually engages, it does so more honestly. Without ego in the way, someone may finally reflect on how they showed up, what they assumed, and what they risked losing. Or they may realize that what they miss isn't the person, but the validation. Either outcome brings clarity. Your peace is not a weapon, it's a filter. It reveals whether someone was connected to you emotionally or attached to the comfort of your presence. And when you remain calm in your absence, you're not trying to shake their ego. You're simply choosing a version of yourself that no longer revolves around being needed. When we say silence isn't a game, it's self-respect, we're addressing one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern dating and emotional dynamics. Silence often gets framed as a tactic, a way to make someone miss you, worry, or chase. But when silence is used as a strategy, it's usually loaded with expectation. You're not actually at peace. You're waiting. You're watching your phone. You're hoping for a reaction. That kind of silence is loud with need, and it rarely brings the outcome people want. Real silence is different. It's not something you impose to control another person's behavior. It's something that naturally happens when you stop forcing connection. It's the space that appears when you decide not to reach out to someone who hasn't been meeting you with the same level of care or intention. There's no countdown, no internal script about what should happen next. There's just a quiet choice to step back and protect your emotional energy. The reason this kind of silence is powerful is because it's rooted in self-respect, not manipulation. You're not withholding yourself to be missed, you're withholding yourself because you no longer want to overextend. And that distinction changes everything. When silence comes from self-respect, it feels calm rather than tense. You're not trying to teach someone a lesson. You're teaching yourself how it feels to choose your own well-being. People often underestimate how much emotional labor goes into staying connected to someone who gives mixed signals. You're constantly interpreting tone, timing, and meaning. You're filling in gaps, making excuses, and lowering expectations to avoid disappointment. Silence in this context isn't absence, it's relief. It's the moment you stop negotiating with uncertainty and allow the connection to be what it actually is. From the other person's point of view, this kind of silence can be confronting. Not because you disappeared dramatically, but because you didn't. You simply stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped compensating. There's no argument to react to, no emotional display to dismiss. Just a noticeable absence of effort that was once freely given. And that absence forces reflection in a way confrontation often doesn't. What makes this challenging is that self-respect doesn't always look active. It doesn't always involve bold statements or decisive endings. Sometimes it looks like doing less, engaging less, and trusting that you don't need to justify that shift. Silence becomes the byproduct of alignment, not a move on a chessboard. There's also an internal recalibration that happens when you embrace silence as your worth. You start to notice how much of your anxiety was tied to anticipation, how often you were waiting for a message, a call, a sign. When that waiting ends, your nervous system begins to settle. You become more present in your own life. That grounding is what truly changes the dynamic, because you're no longer emotionally dependent on someone else's behavior. If someone responds to your silence with real effort and accountability, that's information. If they respond with indifference or disappear entirely, that's also information. Silence doesn't guarantee a specific outcome, and that's the point. It's not about controlling the result. It's about honoring yourself regardless of the result. When silence is self-worth, it's not empty. It's full of clarity, peace, and boundaries that don't need to be explained. And that kind of silence doesn't beg to be broken. It speaks for itself. When we say consistency is more attractive than confrontation, we're talking about the subtle power of actions over words, of behavior over promises. Many people believe that to be noticed, to be valued, or to create change in someone's behavior, they need to confront, argue, or demand. But in reality, confrontation often triggers defensiveness, excuses, and rationalizations. Words can be debated, actions cannot. Consistency communicates standards without argument, and that's what the ego and the heart ultimately responds to. Consistency is about aligning your responses with reality. If someone repeatedly shows up late, cancels plans, or communicates sporadically, responding emotionally to each instance doesn't create respect. It creates drama. Instead, responding consistently to their behavior by adjusting your time, availability, or emotional energy sets a clear expectation without requiring a speech. When you act in alignment with your values, your behavior becomes the standard by which they measure themselves. They either meet it or they show you who they really are. This approach also removes ambiguity. One of the reasons people take others for granted is because they don't know where the line is. They test limits because they assume boundaries are negotiable. Consistency eliminates negotiation by embodying the standard. You don't have to repeat yourself or plead for consideration. You simply respond the same way each time, which sends a powerful message. The way you show up matters, and it has consequences. Consistency communicates self-worth quietly but unmistakably. When you maintain your standards without drama and without resorting to ultimatums, you demonstrate that your value isn't dependent on someone else's recognition. That stability is magnetic because it signals emotional maturity. People are drawn to those who are predictable in their self-respect, not in their availability. It's not about being rigid or cold. It's about being unwavering in the way you treat yourself and what you will accept from others. Another aspect of consistency is that it forces clarity for both parties. When someone consistently fails to meet your standard, you gain insight into the kind of person they truly are. You're no longer caught up in hope, excuses, or wishful thinking. You're responding to reality, not to the version of them you imagine. And that clarity is liberating. It allows you to invest in people who meet your standard and disengage from those who don't. Consistency also shifts the power dynamic in relationships. When you stop reacting to inconsistency with emotional highs and lows, you stop giving someone control over your state. They can no longer manipulate your attention or affection through mixed signals because your responses are steady. This doesn't make you manipulative, it makes you anchored. And anchored people naturally command respect. Importantly, consistency isn't about perfection or rigidity. It's about reliability in alignment with your values. It's not punishing someone for failing. It's showing that your energy, time, and care are finite and deserve to be treated with thoughtfulness. That in itself is deeply attractive because it communicates self-respect and emotional intelligence, qualities that words alone can never convey. Consistency is powerful because it allows action to speak louder than confrontation ever could. Confrontation might provoke a reaction, but consistency cultivates awareness, respect, and reflection. It doesn't force someone to change, it gives them the space to decide if they can. And in doing so, it protects your peace, reinforces your value, and attracts people who are willing to rise to the standard you've quietly set. When we say the right person notices when access changes, what we're really talking about the way human behavior naturally responds to value and presence. Most people think attention, effort, and emotional energy are things to be given freely and endlessly, but the truth is that people often respond only when they realize what they risk losing. Access, your time, your energy, your presence, is a reflection of how much someone matters in your life. And when that access is reduced or removed, it becomes a mirror that reflects their true intentions, priorities, and level of care. The key here is subtlety. You don't need to announce that you're stepping back, and you certainly don't need to dramatize it. Quietly adjusting your availability sends a far stronger signal than words ever could. When someone notices that you're no longer instantly reachable, no longer over-investing, no longer accommodating every whim, it forces them to process the reality of your value. And for the right person, this shift triggers reflection. They realize that the access they once took for granted was not infinite, and that their behavior has consequences they can no longer ignore. This moment of realization is crucial because it separates attachment from genuine connection. Some people are attached to convenience, to the certainty that someone will always be there regardless of how they behave. Others are genuinely drawn to the person themselves, their energy, their presence, and the way they make life better simply by existing in it. When access changes, those who are connected to the convenience will often fade, make excuses, or try to regain control without true alignment. The ones who are connected to the person will reflect, adjust, and respond authentically. It's important to understand that noticing access isn't the same as reacting emotionally or out of panic. The right person doesn't rush in begging or trying to fix what was lost. Instead, they pause and reassess. They notice the change because it has meaning. It's not manipulation, it's information. They see clearly what they were taking for granted, what they were neglecting, and what is actually important. And in that clarity, they often make more thoughtful choices than they would have if you had remained fully available without boundaries. Reducing access also communicates value in a very real. It shows that your presence is not automatic, that your attention is finite, and that you expect to be treated with respect. And when the right person sees that, they are more likely to rise to the occasion, not because they are scared, but because they recognize that the connection deserves effort and intention. Conversely, someone who doesn't step up in response to your absence is revealing their true priorities. They were never committed to the same standard, and continuing to invest in them only dilutes your energy and your self-respect. There is also a profound emotional impact internally. When you reduce access for the right thing, protecting your peace, honoring your boundaries, and aligning with your values, you experience empowerment. You are no longer waiting for validation or approval. You are choosing where your energy goes. That calm confidence is magnetic. It communicates more about your value than any explanation ever could. People notice it instinctively. They feel it in interactions, in the way you engage, and in the way you respond or don't respond to them. Ultimately, the right person noticing when access changes is less about them and more about you. It's a reflection of the respect, boundaries, and self-worth you maintain in your life. By intentionally managing your availability, you create a natural filter that draws in those who are aligned with your energy and intentions and allows others to fall away. This process isn't about testing anyone. It's about revealing truth. And when access shifts in this way, the reactions you observe tell you everything you need to know about who is truly invested and who is never capable of valuing you the way you deserve. Here's a short, powerful conclusion in Matthew Hussey style. At the end of the day, this isn't about punishment or manipulation. It's about clarity and peace. When you choose to protect your energy, set boundaries, and live your worth, the right people step up. And the ones who don't simply reveal who they truly are. Your presence is valuable. Your access is precious. And when you honor that, you stop chasing, start thriving, and watch how the world finally takes notice.